Things are heating up in the search for the greatest gaming GPU of all time. In this video, the flagship cards from AMD's GCN 3 generation and Nvidia's Maxwell 2 are facing off over 15 classic games to see which of them is a real contender for the GOAT. 2015 produced some iconic graphics cards, including one of the ballsiest moves either of the main GPU brands has ever made. The AMD Radeon R9 Fury X represented the first time in memory that the reference design of a flagship GPU came with liquid cooling as standard. But that's not quite weird or unique enough, so this is the only time a liquid-cooled flagship reference card was in the ITX form factor. Seriously, if you could find a compact ITX case that could also accommodate at least one 120mm radiator, the Fury X would fit. This was the only way possible to buy the Fury X, with air-cooled cards limited to the lower core count Fury and the lower frequency Nano. The AIO was required to cool not only the 4096 shader units, but also the 4GB of high bandwidth video RAM chips situated directly adjacent to the GPU die. Yes, I said 4GB. The R9 390X, a refresh of the 290X launched at the same time as the Fury series, was a second-tier card that had double the VRAM of the top model. It turned out that HBM was expensive, so it would be a while longer before 8GB options were available, and it was this lack of VRAM, as well as the reliance on liquid cooling, that would limit the lifespan of these GPUs. It also gave Nvidia a rare chance of having a memory quantity advantage. The GTX 980 Ti, built on Maxwell 2, boasted 6GB of VRAM, though it was the slower, more vanilla GDDR5 variety. While on paper the 980 Ti didn't have a lot to offer over the 780 Ti, being built using the same size process node and having actually slightly fewer CUDA cores, the higher transistor count, bigger frame buffer and faster clocks offered a significant spec boost. Beyond that, Maxwell 2's other advantages came from architectural improvements. As well as a bump in IPC, Maxwell added DX12 features, better Mantle/Vulkan support, and better efficiency. The test card this time is another board partner model, the MSI Mech, which isn't as well regarded as some of the more expensive models, but still a step up from the reference cards of the day. This was still the era of blower coolers, after all. The Fury X and 980 Ti will be put through the ringer in 5 titles from 2013, 5 from 2015, and 5 from 2017, in order to see how big of an upgrade they were compared to their predecessors, how well they performed in games of their day, and also how well they held up in the year they were replaced. Starting with the previous gen titles that gamers might still have been playing when this generation of cards first launched. Grid 2 looks pretty phenomenal for being over a decade old. The 980 Ti is occasionally CPU limited by my test PC's Ryzen 9, so there's not much chance it was getting even close to 330 FPS on a Haswell CPU back in the day. By comparison, the Fury X... oh dear. I mean, it's a rare day that I say oh dear to 256 FPS, but that's a big drop compared to the Geforce, especially when both cards had the same MSRP. At 1440p, the 980 Ti drops to 245, while the Fury is still over 200. Again, immensely playable, but anyone keeping score can't help but notice the 980 Ti is almost 20% faster. At 4K, which didn't really exist for the average person in 2015, but I include it out of curiosity, both cards are still able to produce over 100 FPS, even at this high resolution, with the 980 Ti once more about 20% ahead. Both cards are a decent upgrade from their predecessors, though given the nature of monitors in 2015, I don't think many Grid 2 fans would have been rushing to take advantage of them. Battlefield 4's numbers continue the ominous trend for the Fury. The Maxwell card scores about 200 FPS at 1080 high, which is fitting as that's the game's frame cap. The GCN flagship only hits 176 FPS, a couple of frames short of the GTX 780 Ti at the same settings, though somewhat better in terms of 1% lows. At 1440p, the 980 Ti is no longer being held back by the engine and reaches 177 FPS, about the same as the Fury X scored at 1080p. By 4K, the lead has shrunk considerably, and it's still playable on both, but the 980 Ti maintains its healthy lead. Once again, probably to nobody's great surprise, BioShock Infinite proves far too easy for these GPUs. At 1080p we're talking about frame rates in excess of 200, though the gap between the two is actually a bit wider this time, coming close to 30% in favour of the Geforce. At 1440 the margin shrinks to 20%, and both cards are of course still rendering more frames than a monitor from 2015 would have known what to do with. The 4K result sees the 980 Ti's lead shrink to just under 15%, and again, both are really playable frame rates. I remember the Tomb Raider reboot being everywhere in benchmarks around the time I started watching folks like Linus, Jay and Paul, but I don't remember the frame rates being this high. I guess it's because I'm only testing at the high preset, which I do for all games in these tests, as most games have one. The margins are familiar. At 1080p, the 980 Ti leads by almost 20%. At 1440p, it's under 15%, and 4K is still very playable on both cards, and actually shows less than a 5% difference between them. Metro Last Light is a game which didn't do very well on any of the 2013 era GPUs last week. Averages were fine, but 1% lows were uniformly terrible at every tested resolution. I'd like to say this week's cards are a world apart, but that's not very true. At 1080p, the 980 Ti is actually looking pretty good, with 1% lows that are more than half the average. The Fury X doesn't share the Geforce's good fortune, however, and at every other resolution, both cards have a pronounced stutter. Averages are great, however, with only 4K dropping below 60 on both GPUs. In the year these cards were released, there was a marked increase in game visuals, as well as a drop in performance, similar to the kind we saw in 2023 as more PS5 and Series X exclusives were ported onto PC. This time it was the 8th gen's fault, and the older GPUs didn't handle Assassin's Creed Syndicate all that well. The 2015 cards are at least capable of a reasonably solid 60 plus at 1080p, with the 980 Ti managing over 90 on average. At 1440, the Maxwell card is still very stable, while the Fury X is only averaging just over 50, and with lows dropping into the mid-40s. Neither card is great for 4K in this title, but in fairness, they are both pulling over 30 on average. Both cards are immensely playable in The Witcher 3 at both 1080p and 1440p. This title, like so many others, has had the benefit of many post-launch patches, so day one benchmarks might not have been so positive, but now we can say the 980 Ti is capable of 112 FPS, while the Fury X manages a less impressive, but still very acceptable 92. In 1440, the 980 Ti is still pushing 80 FPS, whereas the Fury falls to 69, but 1% lows remain above 60. At 4K, neither card is particularly up to the challenge. The Witcher 3 is one of the games of the era that could still use SLI on Crossfire, and anyone wealthy enough to have two of these GPUs might have been able to enjoy a 60-ish experience, but on their own, the two cards bracket 40 FPS. In fact, the Fury is doing remarkably well, only 5% or so behind its challenger at this resolution, which is a strong improvement over the lower resolutions. Again, the day one experience of Arkham Knight wouldn't have been this good, but although I've tried to keep the drivers as period accurate as possible, I'm afraid I don't have a way of rolling back to the launch version of the game, so I can't replicate the original terrible experience. You'll just have to make do with the very good numbers these cards can generate in 2024. The 980 Ti could max out a 144Hz display at 1080p, and the Fury X could do the same for a 120Hz panel. Stepping up to 1440p is no trouble either, with the GeForce remaining over 100 on average and the Radeon dropping to around 90. 4K is, as always, the troublemaker. The gap between cards is narrow, and the Fury has remarkably good frame times compared to the 980 Ti, but at 52 and 47 FPS on average, these are more PAL experiences than NTSC. Sorry, Americans. I'm probably going to regret including GTA 5. Not this week, but certainly when I get to the Pascal flagship in the next part of the series, I'm gonna have a problem with the 188 FPS self-destruct point built into the game's engine. The 980 Ti is still a way short of this, though I dare say in some less intensive environments it may hit that cap and start to stutter horribly, in which case the advice is simply to turn up the settings a bit. Anyway, at 162 FPS on average, it soundly beats the Fury X, which can only manage 120 FPS. That's a pretty big number to preface with the word only, but when it comes to higher resolutions, that deficit becomes more of a problem. At 1440, both cards are still playable, with the GeForce around 120 FPS and the Radeon at around 90. At 4K, however, the 980 Ti is still over 60 FPS, whereas the Fury is down to 50. Not unplayable, but not ideal. Dirt Rally can churn out some big numbers on these GPUs. In fact, even the previous gen flagships were capable of 60 plus at 4K, and while neither card is CPU limited, it's pretty trivial for them to run. The 980 Ti is within margin of error of a 240Hz experience at 1080p, whereas the Fury can still produce over 200 FPS. At 1440, those numbers drop to 180 and 155 respectively, and at 4K, the GeForce is still up over 100 FPS, whereas the Fury X is just below 100. Unplayable, I know. Commenters on part 1 of the GOAT project have expressed their opinion that the GTX 1080 Ti is the greatest GPU of all time, and I think a lot of people would agree with that. So, when a 980 Ti or Fury X owner had the choice to upgrade in 2017, they had a pretty compelling reason to do so. Assassin's Creed Origins continues the series' theme of ever-increasing system requirements, and while the Maxwell card can still hold on to almost 70 FPS at 1080p with lows over 60, the GCN card has a hard time keeping up. At 1440p, the 980 Ti's 54 FPS average isn't ideal, but it's faster than the Fury X's 1080p results, and its 36 FPS at 1440 is in the lower degrees of playability. At 4K, the 980 Ti is still in contention, if also a little sluggish, but the Fury X is off the table, only squeaking past 20 FPS. Middle-earth Shadow of War is a little more palatable, especially for 980 Ti owners. At 1080p it's almost reaching 90 FPS, suggesting there might be room for some higher settings without dropping below 60, while the Fury X averages 75, but 1% lows fall to just 50 FPS. Turning up to the next resolution isn't an easy feat and requires editing a config file to achieve, but doing so can still net 60 plus on average on the Nvidia, but only 50 plus on the AMD. 2160p is actually borderline on both, with the Fury X only 5% or so behind the 980 Ti and both just squeezing over 30 FPS. I haven't spent a great deal of time with Total War games since the first Rome in the late 2000s, and I haven't paid much attention to Games Workshop since I used to read White Dwarf in the early 90s, dreaming about owning an army of grey wolves I couldn't possibly afford. Still, I'm dimly aware that these things have remained popular long since I lost interest in them, and, like so many games, Total War Warhammer 2 ended up in my EGS library thanks to a giveaway that I grabbed without even registering what it was I was receiving. Anyway, this is the first time I've actually played it, and it's not really my cup of tea, but I can see how it would have been pretty stressful on 2017 era PCs. The 980 Ti numbers are pretty close to those from Shadow of War, though the Fury X takes a bigger hit, and at 4K, both fall below 30 FPS. Arcane Austin's Prey, a sci-fi first-person immersive sim in the same vein as games like System Shock, was one of the less demanding games to release in 2017. Both GPUs are capable of maintaining high refresh rates at 1080p, and both exceed 90 FPS at 1440p. Turning up to 4K is a big ask for either card, as both lose more than 50% of their performance and fall below the 60 FPS mark. With a lot of sims, that wouldn't be a huge issue, but given how quickly these mimics move, I could see 4K gamers wanting to drop settings a bit. It may have dropped under the radar somewhat, but it seems like Ubisoft's For Honor is a game that's maintained a steady player base and seen a lot of upgrades over the years, which in part explains why it required me to update to much newer drivers, as the 2017 sets wouldn't actually start the game. Combat is potentially quite twitchy, and I think a lot of the game's appeal lies in online PvP, so on the one hand it's great that both of these cards are still good for well over 100 FPS at 1080p, and still above 75 FPS at 1440p. At 4K, both cards are once more found lacking, with the GeForce hitting just 45 FPS and the Fury X below 40. Deciding a winner between the flagships of 2015 isn't particularly difficult. The Fury X didn't beat the 980 Ti in a single title, not in the year they were released, or in the older titles of the year of their predecessors, nor in the year they were superseded. At the time, there was no fine wine to be had. The secret sauce that saw the older GCN cards outperform their Kepler competitors over time didn't have the same effect on the GCN 3 card. Or else Maxwell had something up its own sleeve. Either way, the only way the Fury X could compete was in value for money. And if you've been paying attention, or simply know your PC history, you'll know that was where the Fury X fell down. Both cards launched with the same MSRP of $649 US. AMD were clearly confident that their HBM would carry them to at least performance parity with the 980 Ti, and due to the high costs of that memory, the Fury X would receive few price corrections over its lifespan. In terms of performance per dollar, no matter which of the 3 years you look at, the value of the 980 Ti remains far higher, making it the clear choice. This was a significant generation for the history of both the GeForce and Radeon brands. AMD wouldn't try to compete with Nvidia at the top end ever again, with the battleground now shifting away from pure performance and towards the more consumer-friendly parts of the market. In terms of pure FPS, 2015 marked the end of the race, with Nvidia named the overall victor. Of course, when deciding the greatest GPU of all time, value for money is still an important factor, so that doesn't mean AMD are permanently out of contention. Though it does mean the next generation will be a tough one for AMD. In 2017, the Vega 64, a cult classic in its own right, goes up against a card that is ostensibly a tier higher, and which most people already consider to be the GOAT, the legendary GTX 1080 Ti. More on that next week. In the comments to the first part of the GOAT project, I had some people ask how these GPUs do in more modern games. In fairness, it is a couple of years since I dedicated a video to either the R9 290X or GTX 780 Ti, so I guess it's a fair question. Neither 2013 card has much going for it these days outside of some esports and lighter weight titles, particularly the 780 Ti, but I might revisit them in the near future. Regarding these two GPUs, however, I have something more concrete. The Fury X will be tested in my usual roster of games using RID drivers, formerly known as NIMEs, later this year. The GTX 980 Ti was the subject of a dedicated video just a few weeks ago, and it's linked on screen now. Thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.